This one's been a long time coming. It was worth the wait though. Today, I'm talking about The Revenant. I did a lot of research on this one, so let's take our time and dig deep. It's a movie about the legendary frontiersman named Hugh Glass, which won 3 Oscars. Those being Best Actor, Best Director, and Best Cinematography. And I think those are all well-deserved. But I'm ambivalent about the movie itself. It's amazing to behold, but it's long, drawn-out, overbearing, and is a bit of a copycat. If you just want to see the breathtaking imagery, watch this movie. But it is uncomfortably edited and shot. Though it is at least a tour de force for Leonardo DiCaprio, who grunts, fights, and just does some incredible stuff to get that Oscar. You can find plenty of stuff about how tough this movie was to make, all the troubles with the bad weather, and the crazy things DiCaprio did to fulfill his role. I'm just gonna skip all that, cause there's plenty of other YouTubers who have talked about this. Instead, let's talk about the thing that truly matters in movie making over all the rest. Not the pretty pictures, for which there are plenty, or the super long one-takes, melded together to seem like even longer oneers, which, much like the previous movie by this director, are truly amazing. That's not half as important as the actual narrative of the movie. You know, the story it tells. Because that's what movie making is truly about. Once you get past all the flashy imagery, this movie kind of falls flat on its face. To understand that, we have to go into the real story of Hugh Glass. It's hard to get at, so the historical inaccuracy of this movie is somewhat forgivable due to the source materials, but it commits some sins that are certainly unforgivable. Now, I don't think that it's an ugly movie or that it's not exciting at parts, but by the end of this, I hope no one who watches this can take this movie seriously ever again. Many of the problems of the historical accuracy relate to the initial telling of the story. It has always been a tall tale. The story was begun in a Philadelphia literary journal mere months after it had happened, because the author, named James Hall, had heard the story secondhand. It was quickly reprinted in news articles throughout the US because of the concern everyone at the time had over the Indian War that the story was part of. The legend began to spread, culminating in 1915 when a famous poet named John Neihardt wrote an epic poem, further expounding Hugh Glass's exploits. His story continues to be fodder for novelists to this day. You have to remember that this is a part of the whole frontier thesis tradition that I've talked about in another episode. After all of that, one historian has really dug deep into the story, otherwise it has not seen that much scholarship. The movie ignores all of this, choosing to only loosely adapt its namesake novel, which in turn was merely a loose adaptation of the 1971 movie called Man in the Wilderness, which in turn was merely a loose adaptation of the 1915 poem. With that much distance from the truth, of course it will go wrong, but some things that it does wrong are foolhardy enough to deserve admonishment. Since most of Glass's story is only legend, we do not know too much about him. There are tales of him being forced into piracy under Jean Lafitte in New Orleans, or that he lived with some Pawnee mistress after being kidnapped by that tribe. These are not backed up by any sources, and really didn't come into the tale until half a century later, which means they are probably pure fantasy. What we do know is that in 1822, he signed up with the Ashley 100, a fur trapping company later known as the Rocky Mountain Fur Company, which included many famous trappers like Jim Beckworth, Jedediah Smith, and even Kit Carson. The owner of the company, William Ashley, once wrote that Glass was an insubordinate prick in his records. When out trapping from Fort Kiowa in what is now South Dakota a year later, in June, a group of Arikara warriors attacked Ashley's 100. The reason for this raid is not well understood, but the trappers retreated to their boat. The raid killed at least 15 and perhaps as many as...
I need I remind you we already lost 32 men.
33 now.
After some argument, some of the men, including Glass, chose to walk to Fort Kiowa rather than stay exposed in the boat. While hunting for food on the way back, Glass was mauled by a bear and severely injured. He killed the bear, but was left barely living. Two dudes named Jim Bridger and John Fitzgerald were left behind to watch over Glass and bury him when he died. They freaked out about another possible Arikara attack, and so placed Glass in an open grave, took his rifle, and left him to die alone while they caught up with the rest of the group. Glass had to crawl all the way back in his pitiful state, surviving by eating on berries and raw liver. He even used maggots to eat away his rotting flesh. The distance he crawled is unknown, nor if he recovered enough to walk during that time, but it was probably around 80 miles. After reaching Fort Kiowa, Glass sought revenge, chasing after Bridger and Fitzgerald, who had left for some more trapping. He caught up with Bridger, but forgave the 19-year-old kid, probably on account of his youth. Meanwhile, word had made it to Colonel Leavenworth in Fort Atkinson about the Arikara attack. He organized a force of over 100 Army soldiers and 750 Sioux warriors to pacify the Arikara. After reaching the largest known Arikara settlement, a pitched battle commenced for 2 days in August. No headway was made, but a treaty was negotiated. After the Arikara fled the scene after the treaty, Leavenworth had the abandoned village razed. The army quit the battleground, with some new trappers in tow, including Fitzgerald. Glass tracked Fitzgerald all the way back to Fort Atkinson. Leavenworth protected Fitzgerald, but allowed Glass to repossess his rifle. Glass left, swearing vengeance if Fitzgerald ever left the protection of the U.S. Army. So Glass survived as a fur trapper for another decade, even being employed by the U.S. Army as a hunter, until he was killed by the Arikara in another raid in 1833. And that's really all we know about Hugh Glass. For those who've already seen the movie, you can already tell how far away from the truth it really is. It's not about the real Hugh Glass, instead making his ordeal into an odyssey of sorts. The real problem is the way director Alejandro Iñárritu chooses to overemphasize this narrative to make for some contrived moralizing. There are ways to show the point he wants to provide, just not with the story he concocted, because it rings false as soon as one knows the truth. When he says things like,
the rejection of the otherness and the fear of the otherness. I think in every part of the world people has lived together and they don't like each other, but you don't kill the other just because you don't like it or because it's different.
You realize how off base he is. Iñárritu is trying to make this about how racism and greed fuels the environmental disaster that was the fur trade.
Because I feel like this was the first sort of denigration of the wilderness, of the environment. This is, the first bits of capitalism at play.
Funny enough, in the same documentary, they say,
the worst thing you can do looking at history is to judge people in historical settings on today's values and interpretations.
Well, that's precisely what Iñárritu did with this movie. There's also this whole strange plot about how revenge should be left up to God. And that's really overblown. So let's go over what the movie got wrong, and then I'll explain what it gets correct. There is absolutely no evidence to show that Glass ever had a son, yet this movie adds one. Not only that, but they take that whole Pawnee mistress thing seriously and make the son hers as well. This makes for a bunch of racist interactions between the trapping party and Glass's son in the movie.
Well, what about his little half-breed son? And what kind of savage do you think his mama was?
Which is just dumb. Trappers typically would go about the place with extremely mixed race personnel. They'd regularly hire whomever they could, especially Indian scouts. In fact, the reason why the Ashley 100 were even created was that the old trading post system had been made virtually illegal in 1822. They were being stopped from trading for pelts like normal. At one point, you can hear them call the Arikaras chasing them.
We got a swarm of tree niggers out here waiting to finish the job.
This is really weird. because Jim Beckworth was supposed to be there, who was a badass who began life as a slave. Having done some work with Beckworth's writing myself as a historian, it would have been really cool to see him show up. Plus, he's somewhat important here because Beckworth was actually the person to find Glass's corpse and bury him in 1833. So y'all remember how the internet was up in arms about Hollywood whitewashing just a few months ago? Well, this whole thing slipped their notice. They even resorted to adding white characters who were out of place by 15 years. This naked dude in the beginning is supposed to be John Poulter, the first of the Mountain Men.
You seen Kohler?
Who, in 1809, was forced to run nude across the Great Plains to get away from some Blackfoot Indians. What the heck does that have to do with the Arikara attack? Iñárritu, who is trying to show the racist underpinnings of the American West, has to resort to whitewashing in order to do so. Sure, there were racial tensions in the 1820s frontier, but it was never as simple as one group versus another. To cap it all off, the movie has Fitzgerald kill Glass's non-existent son. It's because of this murder that Glass goes seeking revenge, not being left alone to die with no gear like in real life. You see, because of this, the movie is technically racist. It's not exposing racism, it is racist in and of itself. The hokey-pokey environmentalism of this movie shows up a lot. Iñárritu is really talking about current climate change problems now rather than exploitation then. But that does not belong in a movie based on a true story like this. What's worse is that he goes out of his way to show pretty vistas to contrast with the evil Americans disrupting nature. So much movie time is wasted looking at one beautiful vista after another, rather than dealing with the story at hand. It's like Iñárritu just had a bunch of stock footage and he said, use it. This phony environmentalism is even further hindered by the fact that this does not measure up to reality. South Dakota is fairly flat. In fact, Glass probably used Thunder Butte as a navigational landmark, which was 50 miles away. What's worse is that this all happened in June through August, as in the summertime. Yet this movie depicts the winter. It definitely does not earn its runtime of 2.5 hours. The sprawling one-takes that made Iñárritu famous are back to reinforce this point. At one point, we even see a pile of bison skulls. Now, you have to understand this did happen, but at train depots in the 1870s, and they were set up specifically for photographers. Furthermore, Indians are made into these flimsy spiritualists who are one with nature. Iñárritu even adds this shaman character who heals Glass after they go through some stupid friendship nonsense. Now in reality, Glass obviously did this himself. Glass could have befriended some local Indians, but considering he was escaping the Arikara, that's unlikely. There's this ridiculous use of biblical scripture to reinforce the spiritualism at play.
Ain't our place to wonder. Good Lord's got us on the road, whether we choose it or not.
See, Iñárritu is trying to tell us, the viewer, that we should be one with the earth, and that greedy use of the land is bad.
Capitalism as we know it, where if you understand it as use natural resources as your own convenience to get profit, not understanding the surrounding and not respecting animals and nature.
Oh, boo-hoo. Pretty views and spurious naturalism makes this movie much, much worse. Iñárritu goes out of his way to demonize white people. He opens the movie with a burning village, which is later shown to be Glass's village while he was with the Pawnee, and was burnt down by Americans. The Pawnee never experienced any such thing. Iñárritu takes this a step further and shows the village where the Arikara fought Leavenworth.
Could be Captain Leavenworth, boys.
Except in the movie, it just shows them massacred. This is absolutely wrong. You can't just add 2 massacres to history. All that's being done here is vilifying the US needlessly. If you want to show the US Army being jackasses to Indians, there's plenty to do. You don't need to imagine new stuff. There is also a scene when a Frenchman rapes a woman to retaliate for her father stealing some horses. Outside their encampment is a hanged Indian which reads in French, "We're all savages." During the rape, Glass pops in for some reason and saves her, before being chased off a cliff, which he somehow survives. Our hero, everyone. Once again, you don't need to make up stuff to demonize French traders. There's plenty of truth to go around. Along the theme of this naturalism, Iñárritu repeatedly uses an audio clip of an Indian woman saying a poem. Apparently, it's fine to mix up tribes because that is the Inuit language, something that is literally over 1,000 miles away. It gets worse though, because this is kind of intellectual property theft. Iñárritu got the clip from a documentary, but did not even talk to the actual woman who is recorded. She had to find out that her voice was used while she was watching the movie with her daughter. That's kind of messed up. It wasn't Glass who said, it was actually Ashley who sounded the retreat. He's portrayed as young and naive in this movie, but he was actually 45 years old. They also show Ashley being killed by Fitzgerald, which obviously did not happen. He lived until 1838, eventually selling Ashley's 100 to Jim Bridger in 1830, who renamed it to the Rocky Mountain Fur Company. The movie shows everyone abandoning the boat, which did not happen. They split up and the people on the boat made it back to Fort Kiowa unharmed. The trappers did not bother carrying Glass anywhere after the bear mauling. They left him right there on the same site. Plus, there just aren't these kind of mountains in the region.
Joined up with a couple of Texas Range buddies of his to hunt.
What is that supposed to mean? The Texas Rangers had been informally organized in 1823 and wouldn't formally until 1835. He joined Ashley's 100 in 1822, before the informal organization. So what is he referring to in the past tense? Fitzgerald never robbed the company's safe like the movie depicts. In fact, he never...
Texas! Texas! He said he was going to Texas. I swear to God, he said he was going to re-enlist.
He simply was one of the trappers who joined Leavenworth during the Arikara War. But that doesn't really matter because the movie does him one worse. There is a final climactic battle between Glass and Fitzgerald in this movie. It is startlingly brutal and has a couple of twists that I won't reveal here. This, of course, did not happen. Fitzgerald actually outlived Glass by a wide margin. What the movie gets correct is the view of how the fur trade worked. For all the time wasted on other things, I think this stuff deserves much more screen time, because you really understand what it takes to be out there in the wilderness, bartering and working. Every mountain man who did this was quite a character himself, because one had to be in order to survive the depredations. If there is one thing this movie does right, it's make you appreciate how much it really took in order to be one of these people. The problem is, there's just enough of that kind of stuff to make this movie actually kind of interesting. If you want picturesque scenery, extraordinarily long one-takes, and truly difficult performances worth an Oscar, then this is a good movie. If you want a good story, well, you're shit out of luck. Instead, let me point you to a better take on this tale. the 1971 movie Man in the Wilderness. It has its problems too, but none are quite as bad or downright insulting as The Revenant. Plus, The Revenant rips off a lot of Man in the Wilderness. Let me list off a few of the problems with the film really quickly. Just as the last movie couldn't figure out what to do with the boat, this movie just has them transporting it by land. What a strange choice. No one issued an order to kill Glass if he did not die in time. They whitewashed his wife and gave him a white son. Obviously, there is some whitewashing here, but it is this film that gives the legend a son in the first place. There is the same strange rhetoric about religion, but it is not as overbearing as the new movie. Instead, it's more about forgiveness, rather than how evil white people are trying to destroy the Indian way of communing with nature. There was no point where the 1823 expedition had any other engagements with the Arikara. The movie makes attacks happen after the bear mauling, which doesn't make sense. And then there is a final battle, which doesn't make sense as well. The use of the ship's cannons on land is pretty silly too. What makes this movie better is that it ends with Glass forgiving his compatriots and continuing on their way. Although it is rather weird that it is such a happy ending as they walk through a field of strewn corpses. Oh well, it was the 70s. Maybe the director just wanted to emulate Sam Peckinpah. Either way, Men in the Wilderness is a superior movie story-wise. It's still dumb, but at least it's not overbearingly so. You see, with The Revenant, it's trying to force-feed us this whole naturalism versus racism thing, and it itself is racist and completely out of touch with the nature in which it's trying to depict. You see, The Revenant is just ridiculously stupid. Of course, there is always watching The Revenant just to see DiCaprio kicking a horse in the face. Just boom! Right in the kisser. Whoa! There was a bird in her cleavage. Epic staring contest, go!
And now for something completely different.
I can lick snow. I can lick snow too. Hello? Is there something wrong with the camera? And look, suddenly a bear!